A full-scale conflict between the United States and Iran could destabilize the entire Middle East, threaten global oil supplies, and draw neighboring countries into direct military involvement. Gulf states, many of which host American military bases while also maintaining economic ties with Iran, have expressed deep concern about the latest developments. Several regional governments reportedly urged both sides to show restraint and avoid actions that could trigger wider escalation. Trump's position also reflects the complex political environment surrounding US-Iran relations. While hardliners on both sides continue demanding stronger military responses, diplomatic negotiators are still attempting to preserve channels for future agreements related to nuclear activity, sanctions relief, maritime security, and regional influence. Trump indicated that discussions involving intermediaries from Gulf nations and European diplomats were continuing despite the recent violence. He argued that abandoning diplomacy after every military incident would make long-term peace impossible in such a tense region. International reactions to the crisis have been mixed. European leaders called for immediate de-escalation and urged both Tehran and Washington to respect the ceasefire fully. China and Russia also appealed for restraint, warning that further instability in the Strait of Hormuz could damage the global economy. Meanwhile, shipping companies began reviewing security measures for vessels traveling through Gulf waters, and some insurers reportedly raised costs for commercial ships operating near the conflict zone. The latest confrontation demonstrates how fragile the ceasefire truly remains. Even if political leaders insist that diplomatic agreements are still active, the presence of heavily armed military forces in close proximity creates constant risks of accidental escalation. One miscalculation, technical error, or unauthorized attack could rapidly transform a limited exchange of fire into a much larger regional conflict. Trump's repeated insistence that the ceasefire is still in place reflects both an attempt to preserve diplomatic momentum and a recognition of the catastrophic consequences that could follow if the truce completely collapses. The recent exchange of fire between Iranian and American forces in the Strait of Hormuz has dramatically intensified tensions in one of the world's most strategically important waterways, raising fears of a broader military confrontation that could destabilize the Middle East and disrupt global energy markets. The incident occurred amid an already fragile ceasefire between Washington and Tehran, with both sides accusing each other of provoking the clash. Reports from military officials and regional observers describe a fast-moving confrontation involving naval vessels, drones, missiles, and warning shots, creating a dangerous situation in a region where even minor incidents can rapidly escalate into larger conflicts. According to US defense officials, the confrontation began when American naval destroyers operating near international shipping lanes detected unusual activity from Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval units. US commanders claimed that multiple Iranian fast attack boats approached American vessels at high speed, while drones were observed flying close to the fleet. Pentagon officials later stated that Iranian forces launched projectiles toward US positions, forcing American warships to activate defensive systems and respond with countermeasures. US military sources insisted that the response was limited and purely defensive, designed to protect personnel and maintain freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran presented a completely different version of events. Iranian state media accused American forces of violating Iranian territorial waters and conducting provocative surveillance operations close to sensitive military installations along the coast. Tehran claimed that its naval units issued warnings to the US fleet before the situation escalated. Iranian officials argued that the American presence itself was the primary cause of instability in the Gulf, and accused Washington of deliberately creating tension to justify increased military operations in the region. Iran also claimed that its forces acted within their legal right to defend national sovereignty and maritime security. Hence described scenes of panic and confusion as military helicopters, drones and armed patrol boats through the area. Commercial vessels reportedly altered their routes temporarily to avoid getting caught in the middle of the confrontation. Some shipping companies immediately issued emergency alerts to crews operating near the Strait of Hormuz, warning them to remain on high alert due to the risk of further clashes. Maritime security firms monitoring the Gulf reported increased electronic interference and heightened military communications following the incident, indicating that regional forces feared additional escalation. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most sensitive choke points in the global economy. A significant percentage of the world's oil exports passes through the narrow waterway every day, linking Gulf energy producers to international markets across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Because of its strategic importance, the area has remained under constant military surveillance for decades. The United States maintains a major naval presence in the Gulf to protect commercial shipping routes and reassure regional allies, while Iran views the waterway as essential to its national security and regional influence. This rivalry has repeatedly produced confrontations involving oil tankers, drones, missile launches, and naval maneuvers. The latest exchange of fire has once again demonstrated how quickly tensions can spiral in such an environment. Analysts warn that even a small misunderstanding between naval commanders can trigger deadly consequences. In heavily militarized waters where opposing forces operate only a short distance apart, rapid decision-making and aggressive defensive postures create constant risks of accidental conflict. Military experts note that both Iranian and American forces are trained to respond immediately to perceived threats, which increases the possibility of escalation during tense encounters. Following the incident, global financial markets reacted sharply. Oil prices rose significantly as traders feared the possibility of shipping disruptions or a wider conflict that could threaten energy exports from the Gulf. Investors worried that continued instability in the Strait of Hormuz might force commercial vessels to avoid the area altogether or require expensive military escorts. Several international shipping insurers reportedly raised risk premiums for tankers operating near the region, reflecting growing concerns about maritime security. Regional governments also responded with alarm. Gulf nations including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar called for restraint from both Washington and Tehran, fearing that a larger conflict could destabilize the entire region. The United States has claimed that Iran initiated the latest military confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz by launching drones and missiles toward American naval forces operating in the region, an accusation that has significantly increased tensions between the two longtime rivals. US officials described the incident as a direct and dangerous attack against American military assets, arguing that Iranian actions threatened international maritime security and endangered one of the world's most important commercial shipping routes. The accusations came shortly after reports emerged of explosions, defensive interceptions, and armed naval movements in the Gulf, creating fears that the fragile ceasefire between Washington and Tehran could collapse entirely. According to Pentagon officials, the confrontation began when American destroyers patrolling near international waters detected multiple Iranian drones approaching their positions. US military commanders reportedly believed the drones were conducting hostile surveillance or preparing for an attack. Moments later, American radar systems allegedly identified missile launches originating from Iranian-controlled coastal areas and naval platforms. The US Navy immediately activated defensive systems designed to intercept incoming threats, while nearby warships maneuvered into combat positions. American officials stated that several projectiles were successfully intercepted before they could strike US vessels. The Pentagon later released statements accusing Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps of carrying out a coordinated act of aggression intended to intimidate American forces and disrupt freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. US military leaders insisted that their response was measured and defensive, emphasizing that American warships only fired after detecting what they considered a direct threat to personnel. and equipment. Officials argued that failing to respond would have placed US sailors and commercial shipping traffic at serious risk. American intelligence sources claimed that Iranian fast attack boats also participated in the operation by moving aggressively toward US naval formations during the exchange. These small but heavily armed vessels are often used by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy for rapid maneuvers in Gulf waters. US commanders reportedly viewed the boats' movements as an attempt to surround or pressure American ships operating in the area. Military analysts noted that such tactics have been used repeatedly in previous Gulf confrontations, where Iranian naval units seek to challenge the presence of larger American warships through speed, unpredictability, and close-range operations. Iran strongly denied that it initiated the attack and rejected Washington's version of events entirely. Iranian officials accused the United States of fabricating claims in order to justify military escalation and maintain pressure on Tehran. According to Iran, American forces were conducting provocative military activities near Iranian territorial waters and had violated understandings connected to the ceasefire agreement. Iranian state media argued that Iran's naval and air units acted only in self-defense after detecting suspicious movements from US forces close to sensitive military zones. Despite these denials, the US government maintained that intelligence gathered during the confrontation clearly indicated Iranian responsibility. Defense officials claimed that surveillance aircraft and satellite systems tracked missile launches from positions linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. American commanders also stated that intercepted communications suggested Iranian naval units had received instructions to confront US vessels directly. However, independent verification of these claims remains difficult due to the highly sensitive and secretive nature of military operations in the region. The Strait of Hormuz has long been a center of confrontation between Iran and the United States because of its enormous strategic importance. The narrow waterway serves as a gateway for a large percentage of the world's oil exports, making stability in the area critical for the global economy. Any military incident in the region immediately raises fears of disruptions to energy supplies and international trade. Iran has strongly accused Washington of violating the ceasefire agreement following the latest military confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz, claiming that American actions were responsible for triggering the dangerous exchange of fire between the two countries. Iranian officials rejected accusations that Tehran initiated the conflict and instead portrayed the United States as the aggressor, arguing that US military operations near Iranian territory represented a direct breach of the fragile truce that had temporarily reduced tensions in the region. The accusations from Tehran have intensified diplomatic uncertainty and highlighted the deep mistrust that continues to define relations between Iran and the United States, even during periods of attempted negotiation. According to Iranian government statements, American naval forces entered areas close to Iran's territorial waters and carried out surveillance and military maneuvers that Tehran considered highly provocative. Iranian military commanders argued that the United States deliberately increased its military presence in sensitive Gulf regions despite ongoing ceasefire understandings designed to prevent escalation. Officials claimed that American warships, surveillance aircraft, and drones operated aggressively near Iranian coastal defense zones, creating what Tehran described as an unacceptable threat to national sovereignty and regional security. Iranian state media reported that Iranian naval units initially attempted to warn US forces and urged them to withdraw from the area before the confrontation escalated. According to Tehran's version of events, American forces ignored repeated warnings and continued advancing near strategic locations connected to Iran's military infrastructure. Iranian commanders stated that defensive measures were then activated in response to what they considered hostile activity. Officials insisted that Iran's actions were legal and defensive rather than offensive, emphasizing that the country has the right to protect its territorial integrity against foreign military pressure. Tehran also accused Washington of using the ceasefire merely as a temporary political tool, while continuing preparations for military intimidation. Iranian political leaders argued that the United States has repeatedly violated diplomatic understandings in the past and cannot be trusted to respect agreements when strategic interests are involved. Several senior Iranian officials described the latest incident as evidence that American promises regarding de-escalation lack credibility. They warned that continued US military operations near Iranian territory could provoke even more serious confrontations in the future. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps issued particularly strong statements following the exchange of fire. Commanders accused the United States of attempting to dominate the Persian Gulf through military threats and pressure tactics. The Revolutionary Guard claimed that American naval patrols near the Strait of Hormuz were part of a broader strategy aimed at weakening Iran's regional influence and creating instability close to Iranian borders. Officials further warned that Tehran would respond decisively to any future violations of its sovereignty, regardless of ongoing diplomatic negotiation. Iranian media outlets heavily criticized Washington's narrative of the incident, accusing the United States of spreading misleading information to justify military escalation. Television broadcasts and newspaper reports in Iran portrayed American forces as the primary source of tension in the Gulf, arguing that foreign military presence has long destabilized the region. Commentators emphasized that Iran considers the Persian Gulf a critical national security zone and views large-scale US naval deployments there as inherently threatening. The accusations from Tehran came at a highly sensitive moment because the ceasefire had already been under pressure from months of regional instability, sanctions disputes, and military incidents involving proxy groups allied with Iran. Diplomatic channels between Washington and Tehran were reportedly still active before the Strait of Hormuz confrontation, with mediators from Gulf countries and European governments attempting to preserve dialogue on issues, including sanctions relief, maritime security, and Iran's nuclear program. However, the latest exchange of fire has complicated those efforts significantly. International observers note that Iran's accusations serve both military and political purposes. Domestically, Iranian leaders are under pressure to demonstrate strength against what many in the country view as American aggression. Publicly blaming Washington for violating the ceasefire allows Tehran to portray itself as defending national sovereignty rather than seeking confrontation. Rising tensions in the Gulf region are creating serious fears of disruption to global oil supplies, as the latest confrontation between the United States and Iran in the Strait of Hormuz increases uncertainty across international energy markets. The exchange of fire between Iranian and American forces has reminded the world how vulnerable global trade remains to instability in one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Governments, financial institutions, energy companies, and shipping operators are now closely monitoring the situation, worried that any further escalation could interrupt the flow of oil through the Gulf and trigger major economic consequences worldwide. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow maritime passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea and the wider global shipping network. Despite its limited width, it serves as one of the most critical energy routes in the world. A massive percentage of international oil exports passes through the strait every single day, including shipments from major producers such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran itself. Because of this, even a small military incident in the area can create panic in global markets and cause sharp increases in oil prices within hours. Following reports of missile launches, naval maneuvers, and drone activity involving Iranian and American forces, international oil prices immediately surged as investors reacted to fears of potential shipping disruption. Energy traders worried that further military escalation could threaten oil tankers traveling through the region, or even temporarily close parts of the strait altogether. Such a scenario would affect not only Middle Eastern exporters, but also economies around the world that depend heavily on Gulf energy supplies. Financial analysts warn that instability in the Strait of Hormuz creates uncertainty far beyond the Middle East. Oil is deeply connected to transportation, manufacturing, electricity generation, and food production across the global economy. When oil prices rise sharply, fuel costs increase for airlines, shipping companies, factories, and consumers. Inflation can accelerate rapidly as businesses pass higher transportation and energy costs on to customers. This means that military tensions in the Gulf can eventually affect ordinary people thousands of miles away through rising gasoline prices, more expensive goods, and economic instability. Shipping companies operating in the Gulf region have already begun reviewing security measures following the recent confrontation. Some commercial vessels reportedly changed routes or delayed travel plans while assessing the risks of continued military activity near the Strait of Hormuz. The maritime security organizations warned ship captains to remain on high alert due to increased naval operations and the possibility of further clashes between Iranian and American forces. Insurance companies also reacted quickly, with some increasing premiums for vessels traveling through the Gulf because of heightened security concerns. Experts note that the Strait of Hormuz has long been considered one of the world's most dangerous energy choke points. The narrow waterway has repeatedly been the scene of military confrontations, tanker seizures, drone incidents, and naval standoffs involving Iran, the United States, and regional allies. Because so much global oil trade passes through such a small area, the strait remains extremely vulnerable to political crises and military escalation. Any prolonged disruption there could remove millions of barrels of oil per day from international markets, creating severe economic consequences. The latest tensions have also raised concerns among major energy importing nations in Asia and Europe. Countries such as China, India, Japan, and South Korea rely heavily on oil shipments passing through the Gulf to support their industries and transportation systems. European governments are similarly concerned about the impact that instability in the Strait of Hormuz could have on already fragile economic conditions. Officials in several countries have urged both Tehran and Washington to avoid escalation and preserve diplomatic communication in order to protect global energy security. Oil-producing Gulf states are also watching the situation carefully. Nations including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have invested heavily in protecting energy infrastructure and maintaining stable export routes, but they remain deeply vulnerable to regional conflict. A broader military confrontation involving Iran and the United States could threaten ports, pipelines, refineries, and offshore energy facilities across the region. Gulf governments therefore continue calling for restraint while strengthening defensive measures around critical infrastructure. Military experts warn that the danger lies not only in intentional attacks, but also in the risk of miscalculation.